So this is Dave Astels, and I'm David Chelimsky, and Dave's going to tell you who he is.
I've been doing software for over 20 years. I forget exactly how long. Most recently, I did a stint with ThoughtWorks. Since then and before that, can't hear me. Is that any better? Yeah? Okay. I was with ThoughtWorks for a while. Before that, and since then, I've been an independent consultant, freelance Rails developer for about the last year and a half. And as a lot of you know, I just joined Google. So hopefully doing a lot of BDD and PDD and some Ruby there too. Yeah. Oh, right. Yeah, I wrote some books. Test-Driven Development, A Practical Guide. And I was a co-author of A Practical Guide to Extreme Programming prior to that. And I think that's it for me.
So I started in software late. I used to be a musician for a living, and I got into software professionally in 1999, and my first job was with this company called Ignite Sports, which got merged with another company called SportVision. SportVision is the company that does all the broadcast enhancements, like the yellow line in the football games and the box, the strike zone, the K zone it's called. I had nothing to do with any of that. I worked on the websites for the professional sports teams, and leagues and stuff like that. So I kind of started off in web development. After the merge, we had these two great businesses that were trying to merge, and it ended up that the web business wasn't really that profitable next to the broadcast business. So they sold off the web business, and we all went our separate ways, and I went to work with Object Mentor. For those of you who aren't familiar with Object Mentor, that's a consulting company that teaches, that espouses Agile. I just made up a new thing. Any of you come up with a definition for that, email it to me, and we'll start a new movement. While I was at Ignite Sports, that's when I first learned about test-driven development. And I was really grappling with it a lot. How many of you do either test-driven development or behavior-driven development?
Wow. And we do it for real.
You know, I'll tell you what, let's have the other hands who don't, because I just want to, you can admit it, it's okay. Okay, oh, great. Wow. Well, actually, our work is done, so see ya. So the lion's share of you know that when you're first getting involved with test-driven development, it's really a weird thing and it's hard to get a handle on. And I was having a tough time understanding it. And then I read this article that took you step by step, and it was the first article where I saw that. It took you step by step through a very small example. And that article was written by Dave Astels. So Dave is actually my kind of rock and roll hero of test-driven development. So I'm really happy to be able to present with him for you guys today. Anyway, in May, I moved back into the web world with the company I'm with now called Articulated Man. I am the lone developer among designers. I'm writing Ruby for a living, which is awesome. And I use RSpec, behavior-driven development, when I do it. So that's where I am. And now I'll hand it back over to Dave.
Okay, let's talk a little bit about test-driven development. Here's a little definition of test-driven development, sort of RSpec-y. How would we describe test-driven development? First of all, it is an incremental process. It helps you drive your implementation code using tests. And as a result of going through the test-driven development process, you have a large suite of regression tests, which you can continue running to make sure everything continues to function properly. That's what it is, and that's accepted, and it's been defined as that. There are a few things that not everyone gets about it. It should focus on design. It's not a testing practice, it's a design practice. So the focus should be on design. It should focus on documentation. Right? Well-written tests provide a documentation function. They describe how your API functions, how you interact with your code. And it should focus on behavior. And that's our segue into behavior-driven development. We want to talk, when we're doing PDD, about how our code behaves, what it does, what behavior you see from it. Not about implementation details and what state changes are and so forth. So what's behavior-driven development? Well, when we started thinking about this, we're thinking behavior-driven development is like test-driven development, but including the focus on design, the focus on documentation, and the focus on behavior. Right. So it's sort of like test-driven development with these other things made very explicit. And first-class citizens in the practice. And it's time for a demo. Because this is a technical conference, we want to see code.
So we're just going to do a really quick demo of something that Ryan talked about and Eric talked about in their talks called ping pong pair programming. This is going to be a really short demo, but it's just to give you an idea, because I think there's a little bit of a misconception about what test-driven development is, and even behavior-driven development. There's a beautiful thing that's going on, but it also creates an interesting discussion, which is that all these implementations of Ruby are using RSpec to spec out the language, but they're writing the entire spec suite up front and then slowly getting all the specs to pass, and that's not really how it all started. Which is not to say that it's not BDD, but it's not the thing that we're talking about today. It's a slightly different process. And so with that, imagine that we're all working together on this project, and we have to create a little user like an authentication system. And so a user can get assigned roles, and then it'll have permissions based on that. So we would start off like this. I'll write a little description of what I think the user should be. So describe a user. Is the font big enough? Should I make it bigger for those in the back? Bigger. Good enough? Okay, so a user should be in a role. This is why to which it is assigned. So we won't be able to see all this with the big font. But anyway, so we wanted Aslak to be here with us, but he's not. And so this is going to be about Dave, and then we'll have another one about Aslak in a minute. So Dave, assign role. Now notice, I'm starting with Dave, assign role. I'm thinking about the intention of what I'm going to describe. I don't know about any objects yet. I don't know about any classes yet. All right, should be in a role speaker. And then, since I assigned Dave that role, then Dave should be in role speaker. All right. And, I forgot a very important part here, which is, I saw in IRC someone said, God, everybody's talking about autotest, and I'm going to talk about autotest too. Because RSpec hooks into it, and so I'll run it here. And notice my screen is laid out somewhat like the Eric Hodel screen. I'm not quite there yet, but we'll get there.
Autotest on top, we can't read.
Okay. And I'll make it bigger too.
Thank you.
All right, there it is. So, but now we can't see the whole thing, so I'm going to have to make this side smaller. All right, so it says that there's no variable named Dave. So this is what test-driven development is about. It's what behavior-driven development started off as. You write the intent of what you're going to do, and then you listen to the system telling you what you have to do next. And the system here is telling me that I need a variable named Dave. So I'm going to do that. Dave equals user new. And I happen to have set up a class called user. And now we're at a different kind of failure. There's no method assign role. I'm going to pass it over to Dave now to make the test pass from here. So,
yeah. So this is the idea of ping pong programming, is that you write the smallest test you can to fail, and then pass it to the other person, and their goal is to do as little amount of work as they can to get that test to pass. And they write another test to try and make you do work. And it's a bit of a competition. It's kind of fun. So we need a method, assign role. And we're just going to start off very simply. Okay, we need an argument for that.
So auto test just ran. If you guys didn't see that, because it happens really fast.
Okay, now we need an enroll method. Likewise, that needs an argument. And now we're getting something a little different. We're getting a failure. Everything's working, it's not getting the result that we told it to expect. So, by following, do the simplest thing that could possibly work. Notably, not the stupidest thing that could possibly work. The simplest thing. We just return true here.
Well, that is the stupidest thing that could possibly work. But that's what we do, and we, as devoted TDDers, we accept that and we do that, and you'll understand why in a minute if you don't already.
Yeah. The key is we're working very incrementally, one example at a time, one test at a time, and for what we have here, that is the simplest thing that could work. That satisfies our test. Now, it's my turn. So it should not be in a role.
I gave Dave the longer sentence to type.
Which we need a generator, Dr. Nick. Okay, so now here we're going to say, now this is ASLAC. Now I tend to write these things backwards. I start with the end result that I want. So I'll say ASLAC should not be in role speaker. And then I say, what do I have to do to set up the world to make that a valid assumption or a valid statement? We're not going to assign the speaker role, but we do, as we saw before, we can create a new user called ASLAC. I'll save that, and I get a failure, and I pass it back to Dave to make it work.
All right, so going back over to here, the simplest thing I think we can do is just assign to instance variable this value role, and then check and make sure that that equals the role. Save that, and ta-da, that passes. So now we have a little bit of implementation. This is actually as far as we're going to go right now, but I know that some of you are thinking, but wait, what about multiple roles, and what about permissions, and this and that? And those are all good questions, but remember that, a couple of us have done this. I'm pointing at the screen, can you see? The enroll method here started off saying true, and that was enough to pass all the tests that existed at the time, which was just the one, or all the specs. It's hard to get away from that word. But, the next thing to do was not to change the implementation. It's to force yourself with some discipline to write the next example that fails, and that forces you to come back and write just enough code to make that pass, and that's what the cycle is. I think that's enough for... Yeah. There's some other things I can show you about the spec runner, but we'll come back to that a little bit later. Hey, Ryan, was that okay?
Sure.
Okay. All right. So a little bit of history.
Okay. Pre-PDD, my history goes back to the early days of PDD. I followed this as Kent was articulating it. And then in 2004, early 2004, ASLAC, how many people know ASLAC? A good number, excellent. ASLAC was with ThoughtWorks and in the London office, and he struck up conversations with Dan North, who coined the phrase behavior-driven development. And so they started talking about these ideas, developing these ideas. The idea that everything's behavior that we're really interested in. If your code doesn't have interesting behavior, then it doesn't really do much, and it doesn't have much value. Following that, Aslak moved over to the States for a while, and I ended up on a project with him, with ThoughtWorks, and we continued those discussions, and that's where I started getting caught up in the BDD idea. And we talked and thought and talked and thought, and this sort of culminated in a blog post I did in July a couple years ago, and I'm just going to read some key points here. I was talking about, wouldn't it be nice to have a framework that would implement these ideas and let us use these ideas? And I was just starting to dabble with Ruby a little bit at the time, and my comment was, well, I can see how this could easily be done in Smalltalk, and from what I know about Ruby, it could probably easily be done in Ruby too. Right, and the quotes here. The idea of taking these things, instead of having external functions the way we do in the testing family of frameworks, being able to embed that into the class framework itself. Be able to say things like actual should equal expected, instead of assert equals expected actual. As soon as that was posted, a friend of mine, Stephen Baker, read it and said, hell yeah, I could do that. That's no problem. And immediately started writing some code for it. I got involved. A couple other people got involved early on. In December, we moved it to Ruby Forge, and a lot of other people started looking at it. Then after that, Aslak got involved in the project. David got involved in the project. And it so happened that during the first part of 2006, Aslak, David, and I were all working in the Chicago area. So we got together and did little hackfests and so forth to move the project forward. The next sort of milestone in August 2006, Stephen passed the leadership of the project over to David. And at this point, I'm going to pass the history over to David.
So I added this just because there was in the Rubinius talk, Evan talked about the notion of eating your own dog food. And so that was in the Rubinius talk, wasn't it? Okay, thank you. And so I thought I'd point out, we did have a release where we made a transition. It started off, actually, that it was all tested with test unit. And then we got the framework to a point where we felt it would be beneficial and somewhat of a stake in the ground if we said, you know what, let's do it all with RSpec. So it's self-hosting, and it has been since November last year, so for a year. Then in May, we released 1.0 while we were at RailsConf.
So this is the conference-driven development release cycle.
Right. Yeah, and then actually I think a significant milestone was that in June when JRuby shipped 1.0, it shipped with the RSpec gem installed. So all the people who were in the Java world who were just learning about Ruby through JRuby are getting exposed to RSpec as they're doing that. So that's pretty exciting for us. There's a release that's pending, and it's going to introduce a new bit that we're going to show you, and calling it a bit is really an understatement. There's a whole new piece of the framework called the story framework. We're also doing something where we're kind of riding on top of test unit, so that for those of you who have thought about dabbling with RSpec, but you've already got a big investment in tests, you'll be able to actually very gradually change your test suite into a spec suite, run it all in one process. Archive will give you the right answer, all that kind of stuff. So was that a question or just a stretch? Okay, stretch. All right. Now, when we do the 1.1 release, it's not going to be totally ready for use in that way, but a lot of the stepping stones to get there are. We should have 1.1.1 out, sometime in December or January, and you'll be able to start doing that. All right, so behavior-driven development started off as Dave described. There were these conversations about test-driven development problems, trying to help people to understand what it was. So it really started off mired in test-driven development. While RSpec was born and evolving, over in England, Dan was working on JBehave, which was the first Java BDD framework. And that had a very different kind of flavor to it. There are these words we like to use. Instead of saying preconditions and an event and postconditions, he says given, when, and then. The reason for that is that customers can understand that. And the idea is we want a sort of customer-facing component to this. And so JBehave was working sort of from the customer down, and RSpec was kind of working from the customer, from the developer up. And RSpec's been sort of trying to ride the line of both worlds, like being able to satisfy the needs of the developer and also being able to be customer-facing. And it's never quite done as great a job as being the customer-facing piece as it could. And so recently, Dan did a port of JBehave to Ruby, and it was called RBehave. And he used RSpec to drive it. And so Dan and I talked about it a little bit, and we decided we'd merge the projects together. And we decided only because RSpec has some momentum and a user base that we would merge RBehave into RSpec. So the story runner, or story framework that we're going to show you, is RBehave. So test-driven development was early on, it was just thought of, behavior-driven development was early on thought of as TDD with should instead of a surf. But it's actually become quite a bit more than that at this point. Oh, yeah, sure.
Oh, you wanted to do that?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay.
All right, so it's become like a complete agile process. So, like, how many of you are familiar with extreme programming? And, okay, so the notion of customer acceptance tests is going to be familiar to some of you, most of you. Do you know about domain-driven design? Anybody who's familiar with that? The basic premise of domain-driven design is to have a ubiquitous language that comes from the customer, how they talk about the domain. And it sort of kind of dates back to the early days of object-oriented programming, where the idea was we want to be able to use the same words in the software that we do when we talk about the thing that we're modeling, so we want to try and model the real world. And there's been as design patterns have emerged, and there's all kinds of things we do to modularize our systems, it's hard to start naming all those objects after those things. So basically, the idea behind DDD, well, there's a whole lot of ideas. One of the ideas in DDD is that you, at the highest level of the system, you name all the objects and the methods on them the way you would talk about them in the real world. So it's not that new, but it's very well refined. There's a book called Domain-Driven Design by Eric Evans, and I'd highly recommend that. So in extreme programming, there's this notion of customer tests or customer acceptance tests. And the idea is that you get together at an iteration planning meeting and you decide what user stories you're going to choose for that iteration. Is there anybody here who does not know what acceptance tests and user stories are? Please don't be embarrassed. Okay, there's one person. So for you, I should make you stand up and give your name, but I won't. So basically the idea is that the customer defines tests that describe how the system should behave at the highest levels, and those serve as, and those get written at the beginning of an iteration. And then the developers write code against that, and when that passes, then that's considered acceptance of that story, that user story. And a user story is a way of expressing a customer requirement. I don't want to go into too much detail about what these are. But so one of the things, like I was on a project for a while, and we were using fitness, and fitness is based on FIT. FIT is the framework for integration testing written by Ward Cunningham. And fitness, who which is written by Micah Martin, who's present. Micah. And Micah's got some new browser thing coming up that we just learned about last night. I have to find out more about that. Anyway, so Fitness runs in a browser, and it's a wiki, and it's a web server, and it's a fit framework all wrapped up into one. And the idea is that you can write these sort of HTML documents with tables in them, and the tables actually get interpreted as data that can be pushed into the system, and then you get feedback from the system as to how things are working. So anyway, we were using Fitness, and the thing was, we would go into the planning meeting, and we would do our estimates, which were based on some conversation that we'd have, and then we'd go and then we'd start writing the acceptance tests. And the problem with that was, as we were writing the acceptance tests, and by the way, what I'm saying right now is only something I understand in retrospect. I didn't really understand this at the time. But sometimes we had hard times with the estimates. And I think the disconnect was that we didn't know what the acceptance tests were before we left iteration planning meeting. And so we didn't really have as firm an idea of what it was we were going to be doing that we were estimating on. We talked a lot, but we didn't kind of organize the thoughts from that. So the idea of acceptance test-driven planning is that in the iteration planning meeting, you take a story and you break it down into scenarios. And those scenarios are the acceptance criteria. And when you know what those scenarios are, it makes it a lot easier to imagine all the things that you're going to have to do and create a good estimate. So that's what that's about. And then, of course, test-driven development we've talked about. And so these things are all part of BDD. It's an outside-in process. So the idea is that, and we want to try and take this all the way through. So you start off with these high-level tests. And then, as a developer, you sit down with a low-level framework like RSpec or test unit, as opposed to a high-level framework like the story runner. And then you start at the outermost layers of the system. So like if you're doing a Rails thing, what I do, which some view as nuts, but I like it and it works out well for me, is I start with the views before there's any controllers or models at all. And I spec out what the view is and what's supposed to be showing in it, and then I have to mock out a bunch of stuff. And those mocks tell me what I have to build down in the lower layers. And that's sort of one of the concepts in BDD. All right, so let's talk about the story framework. So the idea is that we want, instead of having documentation of user stories or of some kind of formal requirements document that's in, something disconnected from the software, like a Word document, that can then go sit in a drawer. How many of you have been through that, where you go through 2 months of getting this document together, everybody signs off on it, and then it goes in a drawer, and 6 months later the software looks nothing like that document, right? It's nuts. Like all that effort, you can't say all that effort is 100% wasted, because there's a lot of learning that goes on during that, but we don't really exploit that learning. We just sort of, we remember, oh yeah, that's what the document said. And then if you're in a really well-organized company, you've got some kind of change management process, and you change the document, and all that stuff is just incredibly expensive. So what we want is documentation that's tied directly to the system. So you can look at the docs and see what the system's supposed to do, and if it passes, then you know the system's doing all that stuff. And if it fails, what? Yeah, please.
With TDD, some of the original thinking was that that's what your tests capture. When you're doing TDD, your tests are an executable specification of the system. The problem is your tests are written in Java or in Ruby or in C#. They don't communicate well to the actual user or customer of the system. For the developer, sure, that's fine. It's an executable specification of the behavior of your code, but it doesn't speak to the customer. And so now that's what David's going to maybe talk about.
Yeah, but talk another minute.
I said what I was going to say.
Say something else. Sorry, I just want to, rather than showing you the slides, which I just want to show you this in the actual code, because then we can run it and you can see it's a little more interesting. Okay.
David mentioned fit earlier, and that was the impetus behind that. Ward was thinking, sure, we have all these tests, but they don't speak to the customer. We need something that the customer can understand, and potentially even the customer can write. So that's where the idea behind fit came from. He was thinking, not everyone knows Java. Customers, don't know Java, they don't know Ruby, etc. But they know tables, they know spreadsheets, typically. So if we could write our customer acceptance tests in the form of tables, they might get it, and they might get involved more. And so that was the impetus there. Fit lets you put your data for your tests in tables, and you write some glue code to hook those tables into your application, drive the application based on the data, report the results. Still, that means you're writing HTML files, even with a nice WYSIWYG editor, or you're working in Excel or Word to create these tables, having to import them. It's still not textual and prose-like and as descriptive as we might like. It's still tables of data, even though it's formatted in a very understandable, malleable way.
I'm ready.
Okay. So now what Dan and Dave have done recently with RSpec is move towards something that's more prose-like.
All right, so let's say that we're working on a system that's, this is the example of Dan's blog when he introduced RBehave. So you're working on a system for, it's slightly modified, for like a bank, and you've got checking accounts and savings accounts. So here's the story up here. As an owner of a savings account and checking account, I want to be able to transfer money from savings to checking so that the check that I wrote yesterday, which should arrive at the power company tomorrow, won't bounce and my electricity will stay on. So it's worth noting this format. Forget about the silliness of the last 3 bits, but the important part is, as a role, I want some function so that some business value. And this comes from a book by Mike Cohen called User Stories Applied. Is that right? I think that's right. The idea is that if you use that format as a template, it brings up a lot of interesting conversation, because when you say as a role, like the example Mike Cohen gives is like a customer of an airline reservation system. And there's a big difference between, as a regular business traveler, I want to book my flight, than as the occasional vacation traveler, I want to book my flight. There's a lot of different functionality you might want. And this brings up those kinds of conversations. You end up with fleshing out things in much more detail. And then, of course, the last bit, the business value. If it doesn't have business value, you shouldn't be doing it. That's the whole point of Agile, is to develop relevant software and not waste your time building features that's one of the many points. Not waste your time building features that aren't going to happen. So, was there a question? Well, you're going to do that through conversation with...
The question was, how do you define business value?
No, please. Okay. So, that's between you and the customer. That's up to the customer. As a developer, you certainly have the right to, discuss that with them and make suggestions about it and help them prioritize things. But in the end, the customer is paying for the software, and they make those decisions. In a healthy environment, they're usually good decisions. We're not always in the healthiest of environments, but so okay. We'll have some time for questions later if I don't keep talking. So here's a scenario. The savings account has enough money. So given that my savings account balance is 100 and my checking account balance is 50, when I transfer 20, then my savings account balance should be 80 and my checking account balance should be 70, and then you can execute that, and it runs and it prints all this stuff out. And this is, by the way, the story runner, and it is brand new. And so it's going to improve a lot in terms of readability and whatnot, but this is where we're starting from. So, and then it prints this stuff out here. And then there's also a second scenario down below here. And you can see that this second scenario starts off with, given my savings account balance is 10. And what's happening here is that this one up here, the block associated with this method gets mapped to the string. My savings account balance is. And then the 100 gets passed in as the balance block argument. So down below, when we say the same name, use the same string, my savings account balance is, it just passes 10 to that block. So we're able to reuse these blocks within a story. And this is where it started. And that's pretty cool. As a Ruby developer, I'm happy about that because, I only have to define the block once. But then, well, what if I want to use that in another story somewhere? So it would be nice to be able to disconnect these blocks. And there's a couple of other problems, like, there's a little bit of an imbalance here. We've got all this noise up top, all this sort of code, and then down at the bottom, it's a lot quieter and easier to grok really quickly, and it's sort of imbalanced. It's hard to know whether you just haven't implemented everything down below or what's going on. So, and then the last problem, of course, is that this top part is not at all customer-facing, right? Customers aren't going to look at that and really be able to figure that out, especially if you do anything complicated in the Ruby code inside these blocks. So the next step was to do this, to be able to define steps in a disconnected way. So here I say steps for accounts, and this allows me to sort of group these steps into a namespace. And it says, given my type, and so type is a token, account balance is balance, and what happens is this gets converted into a regular expression, and then when it gets matched against the sentence, the match data gets pulled out and stuck into the block as block arguments. So that one, my type account balance is balance, maps to my savings account balance is 10. And actually, we get to write these things now like this. So given my savings account balance is 100, and then we also get to do this thing. Like in the first one, we said, when I transfer 20. But what does that mean, right? It's missing a little bit of context. I could say when I transfer 20, comma, checking, comma, savings, but that's just going to print out when I transfer 20 checking savings, and that doesn't really speak like a sentence. So this allows us to do this now. When I transfer 20 from savings to checking, and then over here in the steps, right? Everybody see that here? When I transfer, well, here, now you can see it. When I transfer 20 from savings to checking, and that maps to this step over here. When I transfer amount from source to target, and up here you have to do a little bit more magic in here, but this is Ruby land where we're all happy, right? So I'm basically creating an instance variable named savings account or checking account, and I go and get it later. And then this one, I say, okay, source transfer amount to target. And one nice thing about this kind of approach, by the way, is that it lets you, look at that. I love writing code like that, where it sort of speaks like a sentence. And I just wrote that. I had no idea how it was going to work, and that was the API I wanted. And you get to make these decisions early on, and when you get down to the code, I lost my train of thought. You can all imagine it. Okay, so here's the thing. This will run, right? But the thing is, if we're looking at this, there's not a whole lot of Ruby going on here, right? We've got the story, and then there's some text strings. Then we assign the steps. And then here, we've got do and end. Other than do and end and quotes, there's really no Ruby going on here. So wouldn't it be great if we could take the output of this and just paste it into a file called transfer money. Right now it's got no extension, right? And it's the same story. Transfer money, the scenario, the savings account has enough money. The other scenario, savings account has insufficient funds. And now over here, with the steps for accounts, which I want to assign to run this story, run that file. And we can do that now. All right? So, thanks. Now, I've had a lot of conversations with people here throughout the conference, and some people have totally been blown away by this potential, and other people have said, I'll never use that. I don't work in situations where I want to have this, and I don't have customers that I work with like that. So just be aware that you'll be able to use this in all three of these ways. So if you want to stay in Ruby, you can. But if you're in a situation where this is going to provide you some benefit, you can. Let me just show you one other thing to give you an idea of what this will help us do. This is an in-progress, total infant, doesn't work yet, but just like a prototype demo thing to show you something that we're working on. This is an in-browser story editor. So we've got transfer to cache account, and then here's the story here. And then I've got the different scenarios. And so basically, right now, what I can do is I can go and click on Add Step, and I'll type then, and it'll give me a list of the available steps. Now, if there are no steps yet, of course, I can just type in anything I want, and then when we run it, it'll say there's an unimplemented step. So with the very first of these that we do, there's a lot of stuff the developers have to do. But once a certain body of steps have been put in place, now I can say then the savings account balance should be 27. Of course, that would fail. But now the customers can start actually using this as an exploratory tool of the system without having to fire up the system. The QA people can do that. The help desk person can get a call from a customer who says, I deposited $40.01, my account says $39.99. What's up? And the help desk person can actually do this. Please hold for a second while I look up your account, right? And they write this, they see that it fails, they send it off to dev, and then they say whatever it is that they say. So there's a lot of potential power in this, which we're really excited about. You'll be able to, you have an idea, you email to the system, you get an email back a minute later, and it says that worked or it didn't work. I mean, there's so many things, and we're really excited about it. So that's that. All right. We do want to open it up for questions, but there's a couple more things. By the way, I had all that stuff in the slides, but I wanted you to see it with the real code so I could run those things. So when you get the slides, you'll have all that. Dave, do you want to talk a little bit about the spec framework?
Very quickly. This is where RSpec started with the actual unit test level framework. This background's in TDD, again, design practice. It was never intended to be a complete testing story. TDD never made any claims to be a complete testing story. So people say, what about performance testing? What about stress testing? That's always the way it always was. Okay, and I've got the bum mic too, so that doesn't help. It was never meant to be a complete testing story. So all of those other things are still valid. You still have to do them. This just focuses on your development process. So it creates executable examples of how objects would work. That's what TDD is all about. Again, emphasizing in BDD a focus on the behavior, design, documentation. What we want to do in RSpec is to create very clear reporting. Those of you who have used RSpec you can get a very clear, very communicative output. Yeah, there we go. So by using your naming, you can get things that actually read fairly well. Auth, colon, user, maybe not. But using a string there, you can get very communicative output. At the beginning, mocking is a very important part of doing TDD well. So from the very beginning, I wanted a mocking framework built into RSpec. Is Ben Griffiths here by any chance? No. He's with Revu now, I believe. Anyway, when I started this, I went looking around and said I could write one, but if there's one I can just piggyback on and steal, I'll do that. So I looked around, and Ben had something called schmock that sort of fit the way that I was thinking the best. That was the best one I found for it. I came from a JMOC background, and that sort of fit my approach best. So I talked to Ben and got his okay to roll that into RSpec and evolve it in that context. But now you can plug in Mocha or FlexMock or any of the other mock frameworks that you want, or you can use the built-in ones. We also have integration now with Autotest, as you saw, with Heckle, and we're moving forward with other integrations. And that's what a spec looks like. We saw that earlier from the demo, and that's what our output can look like. You can create custom formatters to create, we flipped through a slide earlier that showed HTML. Oh, here it is here again. So where you get the output in HTML. When you have a failure, you get a link to the code. You get the marked up code highlighting where the failure is. And I'll let you talk about community.
Actually, I just want to add a couple of things about the spec framework itself. One of the things that we want the spec framework to be is an enjoyable tool that provides you a lot of different kinds of feedback. So we you can hook into Autotest, which gives you a lot of feedback. There's a couple of other things that are kind of useful from a process perspective. So if I look at this spec, which isn't doing all that much, but so if I run this, it runs just fine, and we get the feedback there. Then maybe while I'm doing this, I think of another case, but I don't want to shift gears. And like if you read Kent Beck's book, and I think you say the same thing in your book, like when you have this idea of another test you want to write, have a piece of paper around and write down the cases that you haven't done yet, and then stay focused on the code. Well, what this allows you to do is say it should handle something else, right? And that when I run it, it says that that's pending, right? So that when you run these, it's telling you, oh, there's something else, and it doesn't have to be disconnected from the code, but it also isn't in your way of doing what you're trying to accomplish.
Just to make sure everyone caught that, you did it kind of quickly.
Oh.
That's just having the it and the label without a block.
Right. And there's actually 3 ways that you can use pending. One is to do that. One is to just stick the pending method inside a spec, inside an example. And the other thing you can do with that, by the way, when you run that, if you don't pass a string to it, it just says pending to do. But if you want, you could say, because my dog ate it. And then it'll say that, so that you can have these things, because seriously, it might be because I'm waiting for this other framework to be done or whatever it is. So it gives you information in the output. And this thing we added, which I think is pretty sweet. So let's say that there's no savings type, so we get an error, right? And so what we can do is wrap this in a block, and it'll just come up as pending. But what it did was it actually ran the block, assessed whether it passed or failed or not, and it gave us the pending message because it still failed. So at the point that you get the code into working order and you run it, it says, hey, this thing's supposed to be pending, but it didn't fail. So it actually tells you when you fix the things that you're waiting to fix. And right now I'm in one little file, but imagine a big system, and then you fix something, and all of a sudden you accidentally fixed a whole bunch of other stuff, and you get to learn about it. So, so that's, I wanted to show that stuff. RSpec has a growing and really great community. I'm really excited about that. We've got these are those of us who are committers. We're not really in a position with RSpec to open it up to committers the way Rubinius does, because there's a lot of people who complain when trunk breaks, and so at least we're not right now. We're looking at other ways of structuring things so that we can have a development branch that's separate from a stable branch, and people can work off the stable branch, and we'll merge stuff in there, but we're not exactly sure what that looks like yet. Anyway, so me, Aslak Helisoy, Aslak, by the way, is the one who created and is working on that in-browser editor. That's really cool. Brian Takita is here. Brian, where are you? Hey, Brian. Brian has been doing an awesome and painful refactoring of the internals so that it can run on top of test unit. He also wrote a really cool mock framework called Double R, or RR, which is another mock framework you can plug into RSpec. Dave Astels, I think you all know him by now. Steve Baker, are you here? Steve's still sleeping. Steve's here at the conference.
He was here.
Huh?
He was here.
You might have had to take off the...
Oh, yeah, I guess he was leaving. So anyway, Steve's the guy who wrote the original version of RSpec, and he's here. And then Luke Redpath, he committed all the nice formatted output and stuff. So we invited him to come in as a committer, and then he never committed anything else. So, in addition...
Just a reminder to you, Luke.
That's right. Luke, you might see this. You're welcome to keep committing. So we've got over 40 contributors, people who have contributed patches. Of course, we have, I haven't counted, but we've got many more than that submit bugs and feature requests. We've got 2 mailing lists. There's a users list and a developers list, and the idea is that if you're interested in getting involved in development, get on the develop list. And if you're a user and you have questions about how to use RSpec, get on that list. I'm on both. And so here's some of the things that are coming up soon. We've got the integration with test unit that I talked about. Rumor has it that mini unit is merging in mini RSpec, and mini RSpec is the framework that the Rubinius guys wrote because RSpec used a bunch of Ruby goodness that they didn't have developed yet in Rubinius. So they wrote a miniature version of it that's very streamlined, and it's easy for implementations to use that early on in the process. So that's going to merge in with mini unit, and what I hear is that this mini unit, mini RSpec duo is going to ship with Ruby 1.9. And our goal is to then keep RSpec running on top of that. And so that's all goals, and we'll see how that all pans out, but that's all good news. Let's see. We're going to move tracking to Lighthouse. Is Rick here? Hey, Rick, Lighthouse. Those of you who don't know about Lighthouse and aren't tracking your projects there, check out Lighthouse because it's really cool, it's really simple, it's really usable, and we're going to go over there. So they've been generous enough to sponsor hosting RSpec there. So we have the account, we're setting it up, we'll make it public sometime in the next month. We're probably going to move source control to Mercurial or Git. Haven't decided which one yet. There are reasons for going in either direction. But even if we do that, we'll probably keep Subversion up on Ruby Forge, and we'll push stuff out there. But if you're interested in developing and being part of that process, you'll want to do whichever one of those we go with. And then this dev is the new trunk. I was talking about that before. You know, in this world that we're living in now, you know, like everybody's on edge rails, and RSpec's trying to keep up with edge rails as much as possible, and it's a little bit of a roller coaster. So for people who want a little bit more stability but get the latest features from RSpec, there will be a stable branch that's not necessarily released that you can grab. And then the one other thing, and this is definitely happening. We don't have a timeline yet, but we have a goal timeline, which is, I'm proud to tell you, this. Aslak Hellesøy. Aslak and I are working on a book on RSpec, on behavior-driven development in Ruby with RSpec. It's going to be a pragmatic book, which we're really excited about. And we should have it in beta, if not by the end of this year, very early in 2008. So keep your eyes posted. We'll, of course, make announcements about that. That's all we got. Do we have a little bit of time for questions? We have time for 2 or 3 questions. Ryan?
All right, so mine's kind of a doozy. I've asked this question of Stephen Baker at SD Forum, and he always blows me off saying, I write tests that are good enough, it doesn't matter. I have some sort of block with regard to RSpec and BDD. And I think watching your demo, I think I figured it out. In part, I'm comforted by the word depth. I like the fact that test unit tests are simple methods, and I can look at a file and know exactly what's going on. You guys are using a DSL, and I really like the fact that you actually removed Ruby from the story-driven stuff and have a real parser for it, because I can deal with that conceptually a lot better. But it seems to me that RSpec and BDD is not the simplest thing that will work. And I think that's where my block is. There's a lot of stuff going on where I look at an RSpec spec and I can't tell you what the mechanism is that's going on underneath the scenes, and I can't just say this is the simplest test that will work. And I know that my equivalent test, if I wrote it in test unit, would be, because it's just def, test, blah, and some asserts. I know that the asserts are blah equals blah arrays.
So what's your question?
So do you what is my question?
well,
is there a way to try to bring those together so that RSpec is simpler?
I think the original version of RSpec started off with you created a class that was a subclass of context, and you had methods that started with should, and then so it's conceivable that we could structure it so that it would support that as well, and then use the same mechanisms to drive everything. I wouldn't actually be opposed to that personally, because you're not the first person to have made that complaint. The thing is, if we one of the big things about RSpec for me was going to the strings, and like a lot of the things that I see, the other frameworks that are sort of modeled after RSpec in some way or another, that's the thing they go for, is like coming up with a way to define the test names with strings. But I don't see any reason why we couldn't support it, and if that would bring more people to it. But at that point, though...
I guess my question really was to the audience and asking if I'm alone. Because I feel like I am, because I have all these people in CLRB and on other projects that are really, really into BDD, and I try to work on it, and I look at the specs, and my brain just seizes.
You're alone, but not in that way.
Okay.
No.
I also feel that we're moving, that RSpec is moving towards more of its own domain language as opposed to being more Ruby code. And sometimes it feels like there's a disconnect between them, and if you don't know what's going on in the underlying thing, you don't really know what your test is.
I'm not sure how to respond to the you don't really know what you're testing piece, because I don't have that experience personally. But a lot of why I don't have that experience personally is because I work on the framework, so I know what's going on internally. I don't want to convince you all to use RSpec if it doesn't work for you, right? Really, behavior-driven development is the interesting thing, and thinking about focusing on behavior. And I think the story runner is interesting for someone like you, because you can use that, as Ryan was saying, in a disconnected way, and it's totally disconnected from Ruby. And then you could use test unit under it. There's nothing that says you can't. We're working to make them work together. So, yeah.
Thank you.
Yes. Story Runner's coming out next week in the release. Yeah, and Story Runner is brand new, and I mean we're not writing the Story Runner stuff in any detail yet because it's just growing. What's up? I guess we have to wrap up. So thank you.